Hello, everybody. Great to be with you. Again, we're not having music because we're in the 9 days. Tisha B'Av falls on Saturday. This year it's observed on Sunday because we don't have a fast on Shabbos. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us for some beautiful learning on Yom Shlishi, Tuesday? Shandora in the Bronx, Paul in Chicago, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Gwen in Michigan, Nancy in North Carolina, Yehuda in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Vaughn in Ohio, Ira in South Carolina, Tom in PA, Spencer in Connecticut, Bella in Florida, John in Maine, James in Annapolis, Heather having problems with anxiety, and this show helps. Thank God we're there for you, Heather, and thank God you're here with us. Clarissa says, Erev Tov. And over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas and Yitzhak in Kansas City. Welcome, everybody. We are in chapter 2, discussing a whole bunch of Mishnas. This is Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. Generally the laws of marriage contracts, but we've been exploring all kinds of related laws tied to marriage contracts through testimony. Who is deemed credible and who is not? When can we establish a presumption and how do we uproot that presumption? Who is credible and who is not? We are continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 7. In a case where a woman was imprisoned by Gentiles due to a monetary offense, she remains permitted to her husband. We have no reason to assume that while she was held captive, that she was violated, and then she would become prohibited to her husband, the priest, if she was raped, and she would become prohibited to her husband, even a regular Jew, if there was reason to suspect that she acquiesced in being violated by her captors. These are very uncomfortable subjects to the modern ear, but in that ancient context, tragically, war was common, and when soldiers occupied a town and took women captive, it was just rape followed. I mean, what a tragic time. I think even more tragically, it's not like soldiers pillaging in modern times are not guilty of this horrendous crime. But the question here is a legal question. When does a presumption get created that a woman who was held captive was also raped, and that would have legal consequences in the area of marital law? We pick this up on page 27a. Now, some say a different version of the tradition that we held yesterday, where this idea was, there's going to be a difference. Was a woman held captive by soldiers who were invading a town and marauding it? Or was a woman held captive because she was kidnapped and then they wanted to ransom her back? Or was she taken captive because her husband owes money and they want to make him pay in order to get his wife back? Or they just want him to pay to get his wife back, period. More of a kidnapping rather than some kind of a collateral. Or was this husband a real questionable guy who said, okay, well, I'll borrow this money, and if I don't pay, you can take my wife? I mean, God forbid a woman should ever be married to such a man. But if she was, what would be the legal ramifications? So Rava said that we learn a proof from a Mishnah for the statement of Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzhak, who said that Rav said, Rabbi Yosei the priest and Rabbi Zechariah ben Hakatsav testified about a Jewish woman about whom witnesses testified that she was taken as security for a debt in Ashkelon. And the members of her family who suspected that she engaged in intercourse while she was captive distanced themselves from her. And her witnesses testified about her that she neither entered into seclusion nor was she violated. And the sages said to the members of the family, if you believe these witnesses to say that this woman was held captive, then you should also believe the witnesses to say that while she was captive, she was never in seclusion with one of her captors, nor was she raped. And if you don't believe the witnesses to say that she was never in seclusion with her captor and she was never raped, then you should also not believe the witnesses to say that she was held captive at all. And in either case, the doubt goes to the benefit of the woman, and she remains permitted to her husband. So Rava asks, but in the case in Ashkelon, that was due to a monetary offense, right? That she was put up as collateral by her husband. But in the case of Ashkelon, that was due to a monetary offense. And the reason that she remained permitted is that witnesses testified about her that she was not violated. However, if witnesses did not testify about her, no, she would not be permitted to her husband, although she was taken due to a monetary offense. The Mishna that we're discussing said if she was taken due to a monetary offense, she remains permitted to her husband, and only if she was taken captive, in the context of this Mishnah, if she was imprisoned due to a capital offense, meaning she was accused of a capital crime and she was imprisoned for that crime, whether she was imprisoned because it's the husband who was guilty of the crime and they were looking for him, or she herself was accused of the crime. In any case, if it's not a monetary matter, but some kind of other more serious matter in the eyes of the captors, then you have to assume that they also raped her because they had that power over her. So according to this teaching now, this story, this incident that happened in Ashkelon, it seems that even though it was a monetary offense, they required witnesses to testify that she was not violated. But if there were no witnesses, then they would have assumed that she was violated, even though it was regarding a monetary offense, not imprisonment for a capital offense, right? So apparently, if the authority of the Gentiles is dominant, right? So not a period in history when the Jewish people are dominant over the neighboring countries, but rather a time of persecution, a time of danger, when there's no reason to believe that these captors would have any fear of reprisal. And so, the assumption then really goes against her benefit. So the Gemara rejects this proof. No, the case where the woman is taken as collateral is different. And only in that case, where her husband stipulated that the Gentiles could take her, would the Gentiles allow themselves to violate her. However, in a case where she is imprisoned, there is no concern of that sort. Now, some raise it as a contradiction between the sources. We learned in a Mishnah, a woman, and by the way, we're on page 27a here, a woman who is taken hostage due to a monetary offense is permitted to her husband. And they raise a contradiction from the Mishnah in Tractate Eduyot. Rabbi Yosei the priest and Rabbi Zechariah ben Hakatzav testified about a Jewish woman, about whom witnesses testified that she was taken as collateral for a debt in Ashkelon. But this is not the case in Ashkelon, which was due to a monetary offense. And it is taught that the reason that the woman was permitted is that witnesses testified about her that she was untainted. However, witnesses did not testify about her. No, she would not be permitted to her husband, even though she was taken for the sake of money. And he answers that Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak said, this is not difficult. Here, the Mishnah is referring to a period when the authority of the Jewish people is dominant over the nations of the world. Then a woman taken hostage for the sake of money remains permitted. But there it is referring to a period where the authority of the nations of the world is dominant over themselves, which is a euphemism for being dominant over the Jewish people. Therefore, even a woman taken because of a monetary offense would be forbidden to her husband unless witnesses testify that she remained untainted. So we learned in the Mishnah, a woman who was imprisoned because of a capital offense is forbidden to her husband. Rav said the Mishnah is referring to a case where the wives of thieves are involved, as when thieves were apprehended and hanged, their wives were abandoned, and they were not protected from potential rapists. And Levi said the Mishnah is referring to a case where the wife of Ben-Donai, a murderer, is involved, as in that case the government abandons his wife and makes her available to all, which is not the case when one is condemned for theft. And Chizkiah said, and this abandonment is only in the case where the husbands were sentenced to death. And Rabbi Yochanan said, although their husbands were not sentenced to death, if the imprisonment is because of a capital offense, the women are considered abandoned, and we would have to assume that they were raped during that imprisonment. Now, that concludes a discussion of Mishnah number 7. Here's a note on this murderer, this man, Ben Donai. So Ben Donai is mentioned as a famous murderer in Tractate Sota, where he is called Elazar ben Dinai, a more common rendition of his name. And he was also known as Techina ben Perisha. Ben Dinai is also mentioned in the book of his contemporary, Josephus Flavius. Right? So Josephus Flavius was a Jew who, in the Roman conquest of Israel, which resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple and the exile that we are still living in today, he switched sides. Right, so he was I think he was like the only person to survive a Roman siege of the city where he had been living, and he was very intelligent, and he was a writer, and he was able to convince the Romans not to kill him, and he ended up writing a book. I think it's called The Wars of the Jews, and some other accounts, and he's actually a primary source for much of what we know about kind of life during that period in Israel. So I guess he mentioned this guy, Ben Dinai. And what does he say? Where it is related that for a period of approximately 20 years, Ben Dinai led a gang of robbers and murderers in the Galilee, until he was ultimately deceived and apprehended by the Roman governor and taken to Rome. Although it is not explicitly stated, apparently Ben Dinai was not merely a professional robber. There was a political aspect to his activities, as he was the head of a group of partisans that battled the Romans. And Josephus characterizes several leaders of the revolt against Rome as robbers. Now, perhaps it is due to that political aspect that the Romans opted to bring him to Rome for trial rather than trying him in the land of Israel. According to Roman law at that time, political prisoners who revolted against the government were stripped of all property. And in this context, Levi's statement is understandable, as it is only in cases of this kind that the wife of the accused is abandoned and available to all. Right? So this Ben Dinai is an interesting case. He's a brigand. He might be a murderous highwayman robber. But it's also possible that he's a partisan fighting against Rome. And in that context, a bit of a hero. But to make an example of him when they caught his wife, and his children and his other property, I mean, the Romans were absolutely ruthless, and they would certainly not stop, not hold back from inflicting terrible, retribution, not only against the people who rose up against them, but their families as well. We move on. Mishnah number 8. With regard to a city that was conquered by an army laying siege, all the women married to priests located in the city are unfit and forbidden to their husbands due to the concern that they were raped by this invading army. And if they have witnesses, even if the witness is a slave, even if the witness is a maidservant, both of whom are generally disqualified as witnesses, they are deemed credible. So therefore, if the witnesses said, even though they're slaves and normally not allowed to give testimony, that, well, no, this woman was not raped by this invading army, then they are believed, and the woman remains permitted to her husband, who's a priest. Again, they're making that distinction, right? A woman married to a regular Jew, if she's raped, it's a tragedy that she experienced that, but she remains permitted to her husband. If she's married to a priest, and she was raped, even though it's no fault of hers, she's going to be prohibited to her husband because of the stringencies of a priest, that they're just held to this incredibly high standard if they're going to keep serving as priests in the Holy Temple. But a person is not deemed credible to establish his status by his own testimony. Therefore, a woman is not deemed credible to claim that she was not raped. the modern ear hears that and we just recoil. This is so awful. This poor woman already had to experience that her city was invaded, that her home was destroyed, maybe that her husband has gone missing, possibly children were killed. I mean, she already underwent all of that. And now on top of that, when she says that she was not raped by those soldiers, she is not believed. How awful. But as we'll see, that's the letter of the law. And the sages are going to go out of their way to find an opening for her so that she would be believed and that she could remain permitted to her husband. Here comes the Gemara. So the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishna from Tractate Avodah Zarah 70b. If there is a Gentile military unit that entered a city, so if it entered during peacetime, after the soldiers leave, the open barrels of wine are forbidden, and the wine in them may not be drunk due to suspicion that the Gentile soldiers may have poured this wine as a libation to their idolatrous gods. The sealed barrels, however, are permitted. But if the unit entered in wartime, then both these and those remain permitted. The open and the sealed barrels of wine remain permitted. Why? Because in wartime, there is no respite to pour wine for idolatry. One can be certain that the soldiers did not do so because the soldiers were preoccupied with preparations for a potential attack by the enemy. Why then is the Mishnah concerned that perhaps the soldiers laying siege to the city rape the women? If they don't have time to be pouring libations to their idolatrous gods, presumably they don't have time to go around raping the women in the city. And Rav Mari said, to engage in intercourse, there is respite. To pour wine for idolatry, there is no respite. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Elazar says in the name of Chizkiah, there is a different distinction between the cases. There, the Mishnah is referring to the siege of a city under the rule of the same monarchy, right? So a monarch is sending his army to invade a city that is within his kingdom, some kind of a rebellious city, but within his kingdom. So in that case, the soldiers, acting as the enforcement body of the monarchy, seek to minimize unnecessary damage to the city, because it's going to be a city within the kingdom of the monarch, and they will refrain from ruining the wine and raping the women. But here, the Mishnah is referring to a siege of a city under the rule of a different monarchy. This army is abroad in another country, and when they lay siege to a city there, they will not have constraints. They will not restrain themselves, neither with regard to ruining the wine, taking kosher wine and pouring it as a libation to their gods, their idolatrous gods, which would ruin the wine and make it undrinkable for a Jew, nor would they restrain themselves from raping the women. So the Gemara asks, even in the siege of a city under the rule of the same monarchy, it is impossible that one of the soldiers did not wander off and rape a woman. So Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said this is referring to a case where the sentries see each other and do not allow the soldiers to plunder the city. So the Gemara asks, it is impossible that the sentries would not doze a bit, enabling some soldiers to enter and plunder the city. And Rabbi Levi said it is referring to a case where they surround the city with chains and dogs and branches and geese as obstacles preventing unauthorized entry, so that we can assume that the women of the city remain safe and therefore remain permitted to their husbands, who are priests. So Rabbi Abba Bar Zavta said, Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah, the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor of the Mishnah, and the rabbis dispute this matter. One of them said, there the Mishnah is referring to the siege of a city under the rule of the same monarchy. Here the Mishnah is referring to the siege of a city under the rule of a different monarchy. And it was not difficult for him at all, as in that case there is no concern that perhaps an individual soldier would enter the city. And for the other one, who argues this point, all these questions were difficult. And he answers, it is referring to a case where they surround the city with chains and dogs and branches and geese so that there would be a big ruckus if some of these soldiers tried to enter the city, either to drink the wine or rape the women. And so they can know that no soldiers did that. And so it remains certain that those women were not raped, and therefore they remain permitted to their husbands who are priests. Now, with regard to the ruling in the Mishnah, Rav Idi bar Avin said that Rabbi Yitzhak bar Ashyan said, if there is a single hideaway there in the city where the women could hide from the soldiers, it saves all the women who are married to priests. Due to the uncertainty, the presumption is that each of the women found the hideaway and therefore they are forbidden to their husbands. Now think about this little exception that they carved out. So if these soldiers laid siege to a city and they controlled the city for a certain amount of time, then there's an assumption that they raped at least some of the women, and because of that, we're going to render all of the women who are wives of priests prohibited to their husbands. But if somewhere in that city there was some kind of a little safe room, right, a panic room, some kind of a hideaway where women could hide, then that is enough to say, you know what, the women could have been hiding there, so all of the women in the city who are married to priests remain permitted to their husbands. Right? You can see that the sages, found a little loophole and then just, brought all the women through that loophole and kept them permitted to their husbands. Now, Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. If the hideaway holds only one woman, it's a tiny hideaway, only one woman could have hidden there. So if you're saying that, the soldiers laid siege to that city and therefore we assume all the women were raped and are all prohibited to their husbands, but if there's a hideaway that now they're permitted, but the hideaway only holds one woman, how can you use that as the loophole to enable all these women to claim that they were not violated? Says Rabbi Yirmiyah, do we say that with regard to each woman who appears before us, that this might be the one who hid in that hideaway and so they're all permitted to their husbands? Or perhaps we do not say that. And the Gemara asks, and in what way is this different from the case of two paths? Now we're going to borrow a principle from another area of the law. As we learned in a Mishnah, there were two paths. One that was ritually impure due to a corpse buried there, and one that was ritually pure, right? So there were two paths as the pilgrims were going up to Jerusalem to bring offerings, let's say for Passover. And later it became known that under one of those paths there was a corpse buried, so that anybody who took that path crossed over a grave, and that would make them tameh, ritually impure, and they're prohibited to enter the temple until they've gone through a purification process. And we don't know whether they took the path that would render them impure or whether they took the other path, in which case they remained ritually pure. And a person walked on one of them, but he does not remember which path he took. And afterwards, he engaged in handling items of ritual purity, like teruma, or consecrated items. So the question is, this man walked over one of the paths. He's not sure whether he took the path that would render him impure or if he took the path that would keep him pure. And then he handled teruma. Teruma is consecrated food that only priests can eat, and it has to be eaten only in a state of purity. So if an impure person touched teruma, he ruins all of the teruma, cannot be eaten by priests anymore. We don't know which path this guy who touched the teruma, which path he took on the way to Jerusalem. Since one of the two certainly passed on the impure path, and we're not sure which path he took. And another person came, and he walked on the second path, and he too does not remember which path it was. And he also engaged in handling items of ritual purity. So two guys come, neither is sure which path they took. What are we going to do? So Rabbi Yehuda said, if this one asked a sage in and of himself, and that one asked a sage in and of himself, so they are both pure. When considered separately, each person retains his presumptive status of ritual purity. However, if they both came to ask at the same time, then they are both ritually impure, since one of the two certainly passed on the impure path, although it is uncertain which, both are deemed impure due to the uncertainty. So somehow they've established that these two guys, they don't know which path they took, but between the two of them, it's highly likely that they didn't come on the same path. Right? They're not sure which path they took, whether it was the one with impurity or not, but they're sure that they took different paths. So with two guys standing there, one of them has to be impure. So if only one of them comes forward, we can say due to uncertainty, okay, he remained pure, and we don't have to throw away all that teruma that he later touched. But if two of them come at the same time, then one of them must have been rendered impure. And if they both touch the teruma, now we have to assume that the teruma was rendered impure. And Rav Yehuda said, so then they are both ritually impure. Since one of the two certainly passed on the path, and we are uncertain which, both are deemed impure due to that uncertainty. Rabbi Yosei says, one way or the other, they are both ritually impure. And Rava said, and some say it was Rabbi Yochanan who elaborates, if they came at the same time, everyone agrees that they are ritually impure. As even Rabbi Yehuda concedes that this is the law. If they came independently, this one after that one, everyone agrees that they are ritually pure. So where is the disagreement? They disagree only with regard to a case where one comes to ask about himself and about the other. So one sage, Rabbi Yosei, likens it to a case where they come and ask at the same time. And Rabbi Yehuda likens it to a case where this one comes after that one. And the Gemara concludes the analogy. And here too, where there was room in the hideout for only one woman, although they came and asked individually, since they seek to render all the women married to priests permitted to their husbands based on that one hideout that one woman would fit in, it is tantamount to asking about them all at the same time, and they should therefore be forbidden to their husbands. And the Gemara asks, how can these cases be compared? There, in the case of the two paths, there is certainly ritual impurity in one of the paths, and therefore there is certainly one man who is impure. But here, in the case of the women who were living in this city that was surrounded by an army that besieged it, here, who says that any of the women were violated? Since there was uncertainty whether any woman was violated at all, one is more likely to rule that each woman was the one who hid than it is to rule that each of the men walked on the ritually pure path. It's an interesting principle, but the analogy is not sound, and you're not going to say that because we would deem both of these men ritually impure, since one of them certainly walked on that path, we can't extend that principle to this city of women, because any one of them could have been in that hideout. None of them were raped for sure. So in that case of uncertainty, let us be lenient and say all of the women remained unviolated and therefore remain permitted to their husbands who are priests. So Rav Ashi raises a dilemma. If there was a hideaway in the city and a woman married to a priest says, neither did I hide nor was I violated, what is the ruling? She says, look, I was not violated, but I also didn't hide in that hideaway. Do we say the principle, now we're on 27b, why would I lie in so ineffectual a manner and deem her credible? Had she wanted to lie, she could have claimed that she hid, which is a much more effective claim. Or perhaps we do not say that principle, right? Now that she said, well, I didn't hide in the hideout, but I was not raped, do we say that, if she wanted to lie if she wanted to lie, she could have said, I was in the hideout, and that's why I was not raped. Now that she said, I wasn't in the hideout, but nor was I raped, why would we not believe her? She had a chance to tell a more effective lie, and she didn't, so it must be that she's telling the truth, and therefore she's deemed credible. We should deem her credible when she says she was not violated. And the Gemara asks, and in what way is this different from the incident where a certain man who rented a donkey to his colleague said to the renter, do not go on the path of the Pekod River where there is water and the donkey is likely to drown. Go instead on the path of Neresh where there is no water. And the renter went on the path along the Pekod River where he was told not to go, and the donkey died. Then the renter comes before Rava and says to him, yes, I went on the path along the Pekod River. The owner of the donkey told me not to go there because there's water on that path, and I went anyway. However, there was no water there. The donkey did not drown, right? The renter told me not to take that path because the donkey might drown there. The donkey ended up dying, but it didn't drown, right? So I didn't do anything wrong by taking the path that the owner said don't take, because he said don't take that path because the donkey might drown. But when I got there, I found out the road was dry. The donkey ended up having an accident or getting sick or was killed or in some other way. But why should I be liable for that just because I took the path that the owner said don't go there, there's water, since there was no water? So Rava said his claim is accepted based on the principle, why would I lie? If he's a liar, he could have said to him, I went on the path of Neresh, and the donkey on the path you told me to go, and the donkey ended up dying. So if he's a liar, he could have told a better lie. Since he didn't tell that lie, maybe we should assume that he's telling the truth. And Abaye said to Rava, we do not say the principle, why would I lie, in a situation where there are witnesses. Right? If there are witnesses, then this guy knows that the witnesses can say, for example, that there was water on the road by Pekod, and then, so he wouldn't tell that lie, right? Or exactly. If there are witnesses, then we don't extend this principle of why would I lie, because he knows he can't lie since there are witnesses that are going to testify as to that part of his story. So this principle, which is a form of migo, right, where a person says something negative about themselves that they didn't have to say, and therefore we deem them credible, this principle, which is a form of migo, is effective only when his claim does not contradict established facts. So in this case, since it is known to all that there is water on the path along the Pekod River, his claim is not accepted. Similarly, as it is an established fact that the women taken captive were certainly raped, her claim is not accepted, even though it is based on a migo. And the Gemara asks, how can you compare these cases? There, in the case of the donkey, there are certainly witnesses capable of confirming whether there is water along the path. But here, in the case of the women, is it clearly established that she was definitely defiled? It is merely a concern. And in a situation where there is merely a concern and not an established fact, we say the principle, why would I lie? And her claim is accepted. So there was a hideaway, right? That's going to allow all the women to remain permitted. A woman comes and says, well, I didn't use the hideaway, but nor was I raped. And that is, we're going to apply this principle, why would I lie? And she is believed, and so she remains permitted to her husband. New subject. We learned in the Mishna, if they have witnesses, right? If these women have witnesses, then even if the witness is a slave, and even if the witness is a maidservant, meaning a male slave or a female slave, they are deemed credible. Usually slaves are not deemed credible in court. And the Gemara asks, and is even her personal maidservant deemed credible? So the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishna in Tractate Gittin, page 73a. With regard to one who divorced his wife conditionally, and the condition was not yet fulfilled, the woman may enter into seclusion with him only on the basis of the presence of witnesses, due to the concern that they will engage in intercourse. If between the drafting of a bill of divorce and its taking effect, the husband and wife enter into seclusion together, the bill of divorce must be discarded and a new document drafted in its place, right? So once a man divorces his wife, they may not have intercourse, right? Once they're divorced, they're no longer married, and that's, that's prohibited. You can only have sex with your spouse according to Jewish law. If he drafts a bill of divorce, that's conditional. This is your bill of divorce, on condition that the Yankees win the World Series. The World Series is not yet over. So they might end up divorced, but they might not. So you would think that, well, right now they're not divorced, so they're still free to have sex. But he gave a bill of divorce, right? So even though it's conditional, once that condition is met, especially if it's a bill of divorce that says this is your bill of divorce from today, if the Yankees win the World Series next week. So once they win it next week, they're retroactively divorced from this moment. But if after that moment, this couple is secluded together, and whenever a man and woman are secluded together, there's the possibility that they had sex. So then that would cancel the bill of divorce, and they would, even the conditional bill of divorce, and they would need a new bill of divorce. That's the case we're talking about. Why is this relevant? Because of the idea of the testimony of a slave. And she may enter into seclusion even on the basis of the presence of a slave and on the basis of the presence of a maidservant, right? So they cannot be secluded, meaning alone together in a room. But if there's another person in that room, then we're not going to suspect that they had intercourse while they were alone together. Even if that witness is a slave who is normally not allowed to testify in court. Slaves, were not permitted for testimony. However, except for if it's her personal maidservant. Why? Due to the fact that she is accustomed to her maidservant, and her presence will not serve as an impediment that would prevent her from engaging in intercourse. I mean, what a sordid peek into life in the ancient world. That like people would not have sex in front of a third person unless it was their own personal slave, in which case they might. Right? So in other words, the slaves in the household, they weren't considered human in a sense. And it was like the same way that a couple would have sex in front of the furniture or in front of a pet, they might have sex in front of a slave. And so we can't assume that if it was their personal slave, that they would restrain themselves from having intercourse in front of that person. Therefore, with regard to the woman taken captive as well, the testimony of the maidservant is not accepted to establish that she was not defiled. Now, Rav Papi resolved the contradiction and he said, with regard to a captive woman, the sages ruled leniently. Because the prohibition against intercourse with a captive woman is based on the concern that she was violated, not the certainty, then the sages relied on the testimony even of the personal maidservant to say, no, she was not violated. We accept the testimony of the witness, even if it's her personal slave, and this woman remains permitted to her husband. Rav Papa resolved the contradiction and said, this law, in the case of the conditional divorce, it is stated with regard to her maidservant, who is not deemed credible, even in the case of a captive woman. That law, in the case of the captive woman, where they said even the testimony of the maidservant is accepted, is stated with regard to his maidservant, to whom the woman is not so accustomed, and therefore her presence serves as an impediment, but perhaps not to her own maidservant. So the Gemara asks, and is her maidservant not deemed credible? But isn't it taught in a Mishna? A person is not deemed credible to establish his status by his own testimony. Now, from that statement, it may be inferred that the woman is not deemed credible to testify about herself that she was not violated, but her maidservant, yes, is deemed credible, and we do believe the maidservant, even if it's her personal maidservant, and we accept that the woman was not violated. The Gemara answers the legal status of her maidservant is like her own status, and neither is deemed credible. Of course, there's this other aspect when you're talking about slaves in the ancient world. Would they dare to contradict their master? So that's another reason not to accept the testimony of slaves, even in this case where you're looking for a leniency to allow the woman to remain permitted in her marriage. Now, Rav Ashi resolved the contradiction, and he said, both laws are stated with regard to her own maidservant, but there is a distinction between the cases. A maidservant sees what transpires and remains silent, but does not testify falsely. Therefore, in the case of the conditional divorce, where the maidservant's silence with regard to whether her mistress engaged in intercourse with her husband renders the woman permitted, as it is sufficient for the maidservant to say merely, I was there. And she is not deemed credible due to the concern lest she witnessed them engaging in intercourse and remain silent. However, here, in the case of the captive woman, where the maidservant's silence would render her mistress forbidden, as a captive woman is presumed to have been violated, and the only way to render her permitted is by saying she was not defiled, there her personal maidservant's testimony is deemed credible. So the Gemara asks here too, there should be concern that she will come and lie for the benefit of her mistress. The Gemara answers, she would not perform two acts of dishonesty. Although there is suspicion that she will refrain from telling the truth, there is no suspicion that she will actively lie as well. Therefore, if she relates that her mistress was not defiled, she is deemed credible. Again, the sages are looking for a leniency that will allow this woman, her claim that she was not raped, to be upheld so that she can remain in her marriage to her husband, the priest. Now, proof that one is not suspected of both concealing the truth and actively lying is cited, as in that case of Mari bar Isaac, and some say it was Hana bar Isaac, who someone claiming to be his brother came to him from Bechozah, a district located far from the Jewish population centers in Babylonia. And this brother said to him, apportion to me a share in my father's property. And Mari said to him, I do not know you. So the brother came before Rav Chisda seeking a legal remedy. And Rav Chisda said to him, your brother is speaking well, and his response is well-founded, as it is written. And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they recognized him not. And this teaches that Joseph left the land of Canaan without the trace of a beard, and he came to meet his brothers with the trace of a beard, and that's why his brothers didn't recognize him. So here, this guy is saying, give me my share of our father's property, and the one who's holding that property says, you claim to me my brother, I don't recognize you, I'm not giving you anything. And so this guy appeals to the local sage, and Rav Chisda says, okay, you don't recognize him. That doesn't mean he's not your brother. He's saying he's your brother. Give him his share of the inheritance. Rav Chisda said to him, go bring witnesses that you are his brother. And he said to Rav Chisda, I have witnesses, but they are afraid of Mari, this older brother of mine, because he is a violent man. And that's why my witnesses won't testify. So Rav Chisda said to Mari, the violent brother, why don't you, so then you go bring witnesses that this man is not your brother. And Mari said to him, is that the law? Isn't the guiding principles in cases of this sort, the burden of proof rests upon the claimant? I'm sitting here on our father's property. I'm, possession is 9/10 of the law. I have possession of the property. This guy who claims to be my brother is coming here and trying to take part of this property away. Why should I prove that he's not my brother? The burden is on him to prove that he is my brother. But the problem is that this guy Mari is known to be violent, so nobody will come and testify on behalf of the brother who wants to get half his property. So Rav Chisda says to him, this is how I render judgment for you and for all your fellow violent men. You created the situation that the burden of proof would be on you because you are known to be a violent man. I place the burden of proof upon you and all violent men. So the Gemara asks, now too, witnesses will come and lie in fear of Mari. And what is accomplished by requiring Mari to bring the witnesses? Apparently, one is not suspected of performing two acts of dishonesty, to both conceal the truth and to lie. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that the opinions of the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, with regard to the testimony of the personal maidservant of this woman who says she was not violated, are subject to this dispute between the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishna. It is taught in a Baraisa. This testimony that a captive woman was not defiled, with regard to which a man and a woman, a male child or a female child, the woman's father and her mother and her brother and her sister are all deemed credible, because normally we don't accept the testimony of witnesses who are close relatives of the one who's involved, but not her son and her daughter, and not her slave or her maidservant. And it is taught in another Baraisa, all are deemed credible to testify with regard to a captive woman, except for her and her husband. So the personal slave would be believed. And the Gemara notes, the opinion of Rav Papi and the opinion of Rav Ashi are certainly subject to the dispute between the earlier generation of Tanaim, as they hold that her maidservant is deemed credible, contrary to the first Baraisa that we cited. However, with regard to the opinion of Rav Papa, who distinguishes between her maidservant, who is not deemed credible, and his maidservant, who is deemed credible, do we say that it is subject to the dispute between the Tanaim of the earlier generation? Perhaps the Tana in each Baraisa holds that her maidservant is not deemed credible, and the Baraisa that deems everyone credible except for the woman and her husband could be explained in another manner. For example, the legal status of her maidservant is like her own legal status. So the Gemara says there is no proof that Rav Papa's opinion is contingent upon the dispute of the earlier rabbis of the Mishnah, as Rav Papa could have said to you, when that Baraisa that deems everyone credible except for the woman and her husband, when that was taught, it is taught in a case where she is making an unconsidered, incidental remark in the context of a conversation about an unrelated matter. That's when we believe anybody. However, direct testimony of her maidservant is not accepted because she could be so strongly influenced by her owner. And we're almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in, please. As in that case when Rav Dimi came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, and he said that Rav Hanan of Carthage relates, an incident came before Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi for judgment, and some say that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi relates, an incident came before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi with regard to a person who was making an unconsidered, incidental remark, And he said, my mother and I were taken captive among the Gentiles. When I went out to draw water, my thoughts were about my mother. To gather wood, my thoughts were about my mother. We were never separated. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi deemed her fit to marry into the priesthood on the basis of those remarks. The son didn't come to testify that his mother was never violated. Rather, he was just telling about the story of what happened to him while he and his mother were held captive. And incidentally, we heard in a different context that she was never violated. And there, the son's testimony about his mother is deemed credible. And the same would be true about the woman's maidservant, that if she just happened to be explaining what happened, and incidentally we learned that the woman was never violated, that would be deemed credible. But if she gave direct testimony that her mistress was never violated, in that case she would not be deemed credible according to that opinion. And that actually concludes the discussion of Mishnah number 8. That's where we're going to knock off. Tomorrow we'll pick that up with Mishnah number 9, a little bit before we reach page 28 that we're covering tomorrow. All right, let's see if we've got questions or comments. It's so hot in here. I'm going to turn on the AC. Okay. Questions on Kesubos, page 27. Tom Beck. That's harsh to abandon the woman if her husband is a murderer. Yeah, it seems like, first of all, who is abandoning her? It wasn't saying that the sages abandoned her. It's just that the government would not protect her, and therefore there's no reason to assume that she wasn't raped. That's the legal question that the sages are dealing with. It's just, this whole discussion is very, very painful because they're not discussing the emotion and the tragedy of the experience that these people went through. The question that we're actually examining is whether there's a reason to believe that, she was violated or not, and if she was, then she's going to be prohibited to her husband who's a priest. Sharon, are wives imprisoned for financial offenses considered permitted to her husband because the husband might not pay the money owed to get his wife back if she was violated? Correct. So it is not in their financial interest to violate her. Right, that was the point they made on yesterday's page. And that's a sort of subset of the financial cases, right? That if the husband owes money, or they're somehow trying to get money out of the husband, so they kidnap his wife and say, all right, well, give us the money you owe us or you're not going to get your wife back. So if they violate her and he's a priest, then she's not going to be permitted to him anyway, and it's sort of not as strong a case of extortion as it would otherwise be. We had that exactly. Tom, if the wife of a priest was raped so that she can't remain married to him, what happens to their children? Do they retain their status as the children of a priest? So that's a great question. Now, I don't think there's any reason to assume, unless the facts were that, she was violated, like no one knew that she happened when she was visiting her sister on a trip, that she was in a city, where the city was attacked and besieged. And then she came back to her husband, and then later they had children. So in that case, if at a later time the witnesses come and say, oh, well, actually, when she was in that city was attacked and it was besieged, and we would have reason to assume that she was raped, and that happened before she came back, rejoined her husband, the priest, and then, they conceived and bore children. So in that case, the children would be disqualified. But if the children were already born before any of this came up, well, then they were conceived and born in the sanctity of, having their father be a priest. So I don't see why they would be disqualified if the mother later became disqualified. She might have to leave her husband. They might, the sages might force that, at least if the man is going to continue serving as a priest. But I think there's no reason under those circumstances to disqualify the male children themselves from the priesthood, or the female children from marrying priests. Okay, so Kevin says, seems like in ancient times there was a great need for generalizations. Why was it so hard to know what really happened in specific cases? Times weren't that different from today, or were they? It's a really good question. I mean, like, why is it that they're going to create this legal presumption that if a city was besieged, that all the women in it were raped, and therefore now they're prohibited to their husbands? Why don't we just go case by case basis, examine the testimony, and see what happens? And I guess the answer is, it might not be that, okay, a city was besieged, and now they decree, okay, that's it. All priests who are married, dissolve your marriages. It might be that they created now a legal presumption that the women were violated, and they have to bring some kind of argument or evidence that they weren't. And so the question is simply, what is the legal presumption, not necessarily what is the outcome of the situation. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Wednesday, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, to begin Mishnah number 9 and cover page 20.